Laba diena! I was crazy busy for the past 4 weeks developing this product. I used to make epoxy casting lamps for quite some time, but I have never took my time to refine the manufacturing process. It was all over the place, really time consuming, and at the end I abandoned the project altogether. Until now. As you can see, these are completely different, only the material choices are the same. Golden ratio was intriguing me for quite some time, and this was the perfect timing to incorporate it into my projects. And if you don't know what golden ratio is, let me explain. So golden ratio or divine ratio is roughly 1.618, and that's the ratio between two closest measurements of some sort. If I would take the height of the casting and the width of the casting, the ratio between these two lengths would be the golden ratio. And if I would take the width of the casting and the height of the base, that would also end up being in the ratio by 1.618. And this goes all the way to the thickness of the material for the base. And what's even more interesting, that two closest measurements combined end up being the next measurement. So for example, if I would add up the width of the casting and the height of the base, that would end up being the height of the casting. And let me prove it to you. So if I would add up two bases like that, it's end up being the height of the casting. And I decided to add one extra feature to these lamps. I created slightly convex sides for the castings. These are convex by exactly 1 millimeter. And it's really subtle, but that creates that soft shape appearance. Plus, it slightly magnifies the things inside the casting. I guess enough talking, and let's start building it, and I will explain everything as we progress. First of all, I had to create a reference form for the castings. This time I decided to try creating silicone molds for the epoxy, so I really took my time sculpting the form. And the block I'm using is just some leftover epoxy poured into a plywood box. And also I've inserted a bottle into the epoxy just to reduce the volume. Accidentally, it happened to be very beneficial because I had a great place to hold onto the block while working. I haven't showed you here, but I formed a shoulder on the table saw, and I was just lazy not to film it. But anyway, that was a fairly simple task. And this shoulder will ensure a firm joint with the base. That will come clear later on. At this point, my reference block is as true as I could get it, and I'm using a roundover bit to knock down the corners. Also, I exposed the bit 1 millimeter deeper than it's supposed to be, and this creates an extra shoulder on every edge. And this will be very useful because I will use that edge as my depth gauge to form those convex sides I talked about earlier. Here you can see me start forming these convex sides, and I couldn't think of any better way than shaping these by hand with a metal file, even though it was clogging a lot, but I used a steel brush to clean it up and it worked out fine. I thought of using random orbital sander, but I'm glad I didn't, because I think it would have been too aggressive at this stage. And I switched to the sander only from 320 grit or so. The rest was just a game of patience. I sanded the casting all the way up to 800 or 1000 grit, and then I realized I don't have finer sanding discs, but I found the whole pile of sandpaper for hand sanding, so I used that. And I think I went all the way up to 2000 grit. It took some time, but at least the result was really satisfying. Here's the final step of reference block preparation: polishing. And I definitely took my time on this one. I've done the polishing twice because I found some teeny tiny scratches from the sanding, so I had to redo it once more. I wish I had a smaller polishing machine than this Rotex, but you know, you work with what you got. But in the end it worked out great, and the result was really astonishing. At this point it was time to mix some silicone, and when I was buying the silicone I got a bit of a consultation from the seller, and I explained him that I will be using it for epoxy casting, and then he suggested me this type of silicone with some special hardener, especially designed for epoxy castings or epoxy molds. So that was something new for me. After thoroughly mixing the silicone, I placed it into the vacuum pot or the degassing pot to extract all the trapped air bubbles from the silicone. And it's really crucial working with silicone to remove all the air from it, because that ensures a good and smooth surface when making the form. As you can see, I placed the same brand bottle in the epoxy form, and of course the fit up was perfect, and this allowed me to add a few sticks and suspend the epoxy form in the middle of this plywood box. The plywood box is slightly oversized, like about 5 millimeters or so, so I created tiny gaps all around the shape, and now all is left to do is pour the silicone. And as you can see, I'm pouring it with a slight angle because I want the air from underneath to be pushed away and not be trapped under the form. I hope that makes sense. Well, anyway, this worked out really great. Silicone is a lot thicker than most of the liquids, so filling these tiny gaps really took my patience. And I used a flashlight to see if the silicone is already covered the bottom, and only then I placed it flat and filled it all the way up. The silicone I used cured in about 24 hours, but I left it for a little bit longer, and now I'm just taking the whole contraption apart. Of course, I overfilled the silicone to ensure that the form wouldn't end up too short, so I had a bit of trim up to do. And now it's just a matter of removing the box and see how the silicone turned out. As far as I know, silicone doesn't really stick to any material apart from silicone, and at this point it seemed that it got stuck to the plywood, but as I investigated further, I think it was more of a vacuum holding it together than the actual bond. It copied the plywood surface so well. At this point I was struggling to remove the silicone, but luckily my colleague came by and he suggested to peel the silicone like a glove or like a sock. And it worked like a charm, and I used this technique ever since. Once the reference block was out of the silicone, all was left to do is put the form back together and use it. And it was really easy to find the exact position of the silicone because it copied the sides so well, and it was a piece of cake. I'm pausing the works on silicone mold and switching on to making the plywood boxes for the first stage castings. I know it doesn't make much sense at this point, but just bear with me, it will come clear later on. So for these boxes I'm using marine plywood coated with phenolic film. I think this stuff is used for concrete form making, so concrete doesn't really stick to it. Unfortunately, epoxy still sticks to it, so mold release is absolutely necessary. And my method is fairly straightforward. I'm using some silicone to seal the form and some brad nails to put it together. And I left one side removable with some screws, so it would be easier to take out the cured epoxy out of the box. Here you can see me utilizing my new painting booth to spray the mold release into these freshly made boxes. While the mold release was evaporizing, I looked through my collection of all kinds of crazy odd pieces of wood to find the stuff I want to put into the epoxy. And that black block I'm holding is the same size as the inside of the plywood boxes I just made, so I wouldn't have to measure these wood pieces every time. I had a great reference point and I just checked if it's gonna fit into the mold or not. And the wood piece I'm using is alder. I found it in the firewood pile at my parents' place. I thought it has a great character and a great look. It was lived by the ants, I believe. So it has a whole structure of tunnels, and yeah, it looked amazing in the epoxy. It has a lot of spalting and different hues. Yeah, just gorgeous. So the next step is to secure these wood pieces into the boxes. These need to be secured because after I will fill it with epoxy, epoxy will push it upwards and they will just fall out. So my method was fairly simple. I just used some packing tape to press them down, and there was some pieces which I wanted to be suspended in the mid-air, so there was basically no place to press them down, or they were just too short for the mold. So as you can see, I used the red nails and secured them from the side. The forms are prepared, and now I'm back at my painting booth mixing the epoxy. I'm using the slow setting epoxy, or in other words the pour epoxy, which sets in 72 hours. And I was working with this brand for quite some time, and I figured out the maximum amount of thickness or amount of volume I can pour without overheating the epoxy. And here I will be using ever so slightly more because I'm actually looking for the bubbles. I want a bit of overheated reaction and some bubble formation. And you saw me adding a bit of pigment into the mixture, and even though the manufacturer says that this epoxy is UV resistant and it doesn't yellow, I made some test pieces like 5 years ago and they tend to yellow over time no matter what, so adding a bit of color tricks the eye. And as you can see, I'm not worried about the bubbles. I haven't degassed the epoxy, I just mixed it and dumped it into these molds. And those tiny bubbles actually came out really pretty once lit from underneath. And most of them actually came to the surface and disappeared, so there's no need for degassing at this stage. It's the next day, and as you can see, the castings have completely cured. It didn't take 72 hours. It took like 24, maybe 30 hours because of larger volume and more rapid reaction. And yeah, as you can see, it got stuck quite well even with these fine surfaces and mold release. But this plywood is really rigid, and I could beat the molds until the epoxy casting comes loose. And the greatest benefit of making the molds using this plywood is that it's fairly cheap, highly reusable, because after a few cycles the mold release builds up and epoxy doesn't really stick anymore, so it gets even easier to remove the castings after a while. At this moment in time, these castings doesn't really look promising. They look rather ugly. There's a lot of open bubbles on the sides, the sides are completely out of shape, and that's the reason I call these the first stage. And probably you can already tell where I'm going with that. Well, anyway, getting back to these molds, I'm cleaning all the residue from the first pour, putting the molds together, applying some mold release, and reuse them. With the first batch, I decided to go with 30 lamps, so once I had all of the castings done, the next step was to sand these somewhat even. There was no need to sand these completely true and square. I just had to remove enough material so there would be no mold release residue left on these castings. I was using 60 grit belt here, so it sure did a quick job of sanding the sides. And the next step was to trim these sanded castings to length so they would be able to fit in the silicone mold I made previously. After chopping the ends on the miter saw, I came back to the belt sander to remove any saw marks from the blade, And once I was done sanding with the belt, I switched to the orbital sander and hit the castings with 120 grit. I did a test piece and sanded one casting with 180 grit, I believe, and I couldn't see any difference after pouring the epoxy between the piece sanded with 120 grit and the one sanded with 180 grit. So basically there was no need for sanding it any higher grits than 120. After sanding, I checked the pieces and some of them needed some surgical incision. I basically grabbed a knife and opened up any bubble formations closer to the sides so the epoxy would be able to flow into these easier. Here you can see me preparing some very thin cuts of square tubing, and this metal will be glued onto the casting because I will have to suspend the casting somehow in the silicone mold, so I decided to use metal and some magnets. I'm hitting the square with some heat because one of the sides will be visible from the inside of the casting, and I didn't want the freshly cut metal to be apparent, so I decided to hit it with a torch, and this way I gave it a really lovely bluish hue. Once the steel cooled off, I used some CI glue to stick it onto the casting. Later on I used the same epoxy to stick these because this glue was a bit visible in some spots. Well, anyway, and I decided there would be a great opportunity to add my logo sticker at this stage, so it would be left inside the casting behind the layer of epoxy. One of the last steps was to create the magnetic holders for the castings, and I'm not gonna go into much of the details here because in total I made like 4 or 5 iterations of these holders, and this is definitely not the final one, but basically for every one of them I used neodymium magnets because they are small and strong. Just before pouring the epoxy, I needed to secure the casting so it wouldn't shift while pouring the epoxy, so I added a couple of wooden blocks on the sides and used some packing tape to secure it firmly. At last there was a time to pour the epoxy into the silicone mold, and after mixing a batch I placed it into the casting pot so no bubbles would be in the epoxy. I tilted the form sideways as with the silicone so the air would be able to go away from the bottom, and I slowly filled the form. I'm not gonna lie, anticipation was truly killing me. I had to wait for 3 full days for the epoxy to fully cure before taking the castings out of the silicone molds, and I was so eager to see how these turned out. Luckily, these turned out better than I expected. Yeah, the outcome was absolutely gorgeous. And as you can see, I'm using gloves to take the castings from the silicone because I wanted to keep the silicone molds as clean as possible. So I immediately flipped them back to the shape and left them covered. So the castings are almost finished, and I'm not sure if I forgot to film it or I lost the footage, but basically all I was left to do was clean up the bottom side where the castings were held by the magnets. So I just hit the bottom part on the belt sander and cleaned it up with random orbital sander. In the previous frame you saw me preparing the stock material for the base, and now I will be ripping it into strips. Unfortunately I forgot to press the record button, so I haven't recorded the actual cut. But anyway, here are the strips, and since I already had the white belt sander, so I thought why not to use it. So I calibrated the pieces to exactly 8.6 millimeters. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the thickness of the material was extrapolated according to the golden ratio. So basically when I was designing the lamp, the only restriction I had was the size of the LED bulb, and then I designed every other measurement according to the golden ratio. I hope that makes sense. Here you can see me using a jig for making the side panels for the base, and basically I using a simple flush trim bit with coping bearing, and I believe there's not that much to explain about this process. And after I had all the sides prepared, I trimmed the corners at 45 degrees and created some slots for the bottom panel as well as the top. And for those panels I decided to go with plywood because I will be gluing it into place, and I don't want any movement from this panel. So for the bottom panel I used 3mm plywood, and for the top panel I used 6mm plywood because I needed some extra thickness so the magnets would have some material to stick onto. And here you can see me using another jig to make a hole for the LED bulb. I chose to go with the jigs instead of a hole saw because I had to make like 30 of these bases. Actually, I will be making more of these, so having a jig is very useful because it's faster and more precise than doing it by hand. And now I'm making the holes for the magnets, and I'm using a step bit, and this was really beneficial because it left a bit of a lip at the bottom side, and it created a kind of a stopping point for the magnets. So all of these ended up being exactly at the same level. The parts are prepared, and all is left to do is put these together, apply some glue, and that's it. Also, I forgot to mention that every base is made from a single strip of wood, so the grain wraps the piece around once assembled. It was a bit more labeling during the process, but that was definitely worth it because these bases are looking mint. Now it comes clear how the magnets are held in place. So as you can see, I didn't have to worry about how deep should I hammer the magnets because, like I said, there was a lip left from the stepper bit, and I just hammered it until it was no longer moving. For the finish I used Rubio monocoat, but only for these first two bases. Then I switched to using two-component polyurethane lacquer because it was a lot quicker, a lot more durable, and even cheaper. And here we come to the final stretch, adding the electrical components. And as you can see, there's not that much to it. I basically took apart the mounting plate, stuck the new extension cord to it, and glued it into the base, and it was done. And here's just a short glimpse of making 30 of these bases. And honestly, I had a ton of fun making these. I experimented a lot with different pieces of wood, and these bases are made anywhere from walnut all the way to the apple tree. But I guess enough talking, and let's jump to the final shots, shall we? First of all, I would like to thank you for sticking with me for such a long video, and in return I will be giving away one of these lamps at the 4th of January. And all I ask from you is leave a comment with your opinion. I value growth and progress more than anything, so any kind of observation is highly appreciated. Sincerely thank you for that. Sincerely thank you for your time, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye bye!